The sword was already in Yusef's bag when he realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. He'd cataloged it as Object 7 Gamma, resonance rod, ceremonial, non-ferrous alloy of unknown composition, approximately 70 centimeters, one terminus etched with recursive spiral patterning, consistent with Varith glyph sets from the third expansion period. He'd wrapped it in field foam, secured the clasp, and was already composing his preliminary notes when the tunnel wall behind him began to glow. Not glow, pulse. The distinction mattered enormously, as Yusef would spend the next several days learning at considerable personal cost. 6 shapes dropped from the ceiling of the excavation tunnel. The Varith were not built for ceilings exactly, but they were built for surfaces, all surfaces, with equal facility, their 6-limbed bodies distributing weight through pads of microfilament that secreted adhesion compounds on a per-step basis. They landed around him in a rough hexagon, and the light running through their chitinous shells went from amber to something that did not have a color name in any human language, a frequency that sat between violet and wrongness and communicated, at some very deep animal level, that he should stop moving. Yusef stopped moving. Then he took out his field recorder and dictated. 6 Varith, adult caste designation unclear, exhibiting coordinated luminescence pattern consistent with, he checked his notes, Apprehension Protocol 7, as described in the Geth-Morin Xenocultural Survey. Light pulse duration averaging 0.4 seconds per cycle with a 2-pulse call-and response pattern between the flanking pair, possibly communicative, possibly threat display, possibly both. The Varith on his left shifted its weight forward by 4 centimeters. Yusef wrote both. They moved him through the tunnels for 40 minutes. He spent 38 of them recording. The Dead Moon's excavation site, Site 11, third expansion ruins, first documented by the survey vessel Karst some 6 years prior, had yielded mostly ceramic fragments, corroded tool matrices, and what the xenoarchaeological community had cautiously designated resonance architecture. Chambers whose walls were embedded with conductive filament in patterns that matched, with suspicious precision, the light communication bands of the modern Varith caste system. The implication that the ruins were Varith built, that the Varith had been a spacefaring civilization, and then, for reasons the ruins could not explain, had stopped, was one that the current Varith government had neither confirmed nor denied. They had simply continued to exist in the Queenhold above the moon's northern pole, conducting their commerce and their wars and their incomprehensible internal politics, and had until today paid no attention whatsoever to the human archaeologists digging through their ancestors' bones. Object 7 Gamma had not been in a display case. It had been in a sealed subchamber behind a door that Yusef had opened with a pry bar after 40 minutes of careful application, because the locking mechanism was corroded, and the door's material composition was absolutely fascinating, and the survey schedule required that he complete level 7 by Thursday. He dictated this into his recorder as they walked, because context mattered, and because whatever was about to happen to him would be better understood by whoever came after if they knew that the door had taken 40 minutes and that he had used proper tool protocols throughout. The Varith soldiers communicated the entire journey. Yusef watched their shells light and fade, the left flanking pair maintaining a constant carrier frequency while the rear pair executed what looked structurally like a series of grammatical modifiers. The lead soldier's patterns were distinct, longer pulses, more complex sequencing, command register possibly, or distress, or a joke at his expense. The Geth-Morin survey had catalogued approximately 12% of Varith light language. The other 88% remained, as the survey's final chapter noted with considerable academic understatement, opaque. The tunnel opened into a vertical shaft. The soldiers attached to the walls and climbed. Yusef found handholds and climbed more slowly, and the soldiers waited for him with an expression. If the patterns flickering across their shells could be called expressions, that he categorized in his notes as asterisk impatience, probable. The Queenhold received them through a membranous valve that dilated at the soldier's combined luminescent signal. The air on the other side was thick with something between ozone and wet soil, and the sharp mineral edge of secreted resin. The station's walls had been grown, extruded over generations by Varith worker caste, whose modified glands produced a compound with tensile properties that the karst asterisk S materials team had spent 2 years failing to synthesize. The walls breathed light. Not metaphorically. The embedded filaments in the resin pulsed with the slow rhythm of a background carrier signal, a kind of continuous ambient communication that Yusef suspected was the Varith equivalent of a public broadcast. Every surface was speaking. He walked through a sentence that was 600 years old. He wrote, corridors approximately 2.8 m high, width variable, floor surface provides moderate traction. Air composition requires no supplemental equipment. Background luminescence consistent with station-wide carrier. Pulsing at approximately 0.8 Hz, possible significance. You will cease the verbal emissions, said a voice from a translation collar around the neck of a Varith who was waiting for them at the corridor's end. The collar was old technology, human-built, the kind that the first contact teams had distributed in the early expansion period. They are interpreted as signal by the station infrastructure and are creating minor navigational confusion in the eastern residential quadrant. I'm recording my field notes, Yusef said. You are also inadvertently broadcasting. Please. The Varith with the collar gestured. 4 of its limbs moved in a coordinated sequence that the collar apparently could not or chose not to translate. You have something that belongs to the Queen. The Queen's chamber was a headache-given architecture. Yusef catalogued this sensation precisely. The chamber was a sphere approximately 40 meters across, its inner surface covered entirely in the conductive resonance filament. Layered in densities that varied by region in a pattern he needed approximately 90 seconds to recognize as deliberate. The filaments were not decorating the walls. They were the walls. And they were active, pulsing in a sequence so complex that his visual cortex, attempting to parse it as signal and failing, had defaulted to producing a dull pressure behind his eyes that was going to become a genuine problem if he stayed here long. The Queen occupied the chamber's center. She was suspended in a cradle of filament that connected to the walls at 43 points, Yusef counted, and she was large. Not large in the way that he'd expected large, which was simply more of the same morphology but bigger. She was large in the way that a brain was large, which was to say that her complexity had expanded in directions that changed the nature of the thing rather than merely its scale. Her shell carried patterns that shifted continuously, not in the call-and-response rhythm of the soldier's communication, but in something more like a tide, deep, slow oscillations underlying a constant surface chatter of finer-grained pulses. She was not communicating. She was thinking, and her thoughts were visible. The Varith with the translation collar stood beside him. There were 20 other Varith in the chamber, positioned at intervals Yusef couldn't identify as functional or ceremonial or both, and all of them had gone very still. The attuned blade, the collar Varith said, you will return it. Of course, Yusef said. He unslung his bag, extracted Object 7 Gamma, still in its field foam wrapping, and held it out. I want to apologize for the removal. I genuinely did not know what it was. If you could share any information about its function and cultural significance, that would be tremendously helpful for the... Simply hold it out, the collar Varith said. The Queen will. The foam unwrapped. Yusef had been peeling it back as he spoke, because it seemed polite to present the object uncovered, and the moment the alloy's surface came free of the foam, the entire chamber changed. The Queen's pattern, that deep tidal oscillation, hitched. A single missed beat like a heart skipping, and then every filament in every wall responded to the skip. The background pulse stuttered, recovered, stuttered again. The 43 connection points between the queen's cradle and the walls flared to a white that had no business existing in a biological system. And the Varith along the walls all took one step backward in perfect synchrony, which told Yusef more about how frightened they were than anything else could have. That is, the caller Varith began. The blade is resonating with something, Yusef said. He turned it slowly. The alloy was warm, not warm the way metal got warm in an atmosphere, warm the way a tuning fork got warm when it was vibrating at a frequency just below audible range. Is it supposed to do that? No, the caller Varith said, and the translation caller produced the word in a voice register that Yusef was fairly sure was used for things like the hull has failed, and we are all going to die. He looked at the blade. The blade, Object 7 Gamma, the thing he'd carried in his bag for 3 hours, was pulsing, not reflecting the room's light, generating its own in a pattern that was, unmistakably, not the Queen's pattern. It was something that resembled his pulse, his respiration, the specific bioelectrical signature of a human nervous system that had spent 3 hours carrying it through a pressurized tunnel, and then climbing a vertical shaft, and then walking through a corridor that had been broadcasting at him. The blade had been listening. The attuned blade, the caller Varith said, in a voice that had moved past asterisk hull failure into territory that had no register, bonds to the bioelectrical signature of whoever carries it for an extended period. It was designed to attune to the Queen. It has. Attune to me instead, Yusef said. The chamber went dark. Not completely, the emergency carrier pulses in the walls kept their rhythm, but the Queen's tidal oscillation flatlined, and in the sudden absence of it, every Varith in the room made a sound that the translation caller rendered, with what Yusef felt was inadequate context as, "Oh no." Somewhere in the station, a secondary resonance chamber was eating itself, and Yusef was the only one who found that interesting rather than fatal. He found it interesting because he had been recording for 2 days. 2 days in a holding cell, not uncomfortable. The Varith had provided food and air and a sleeping platform, and the cell walls had maintained their background pulse at what he'd eventually identified as a deliberately calming frequency. And Yusef had spent them organizing his notes, charting pulse patterns, and mapping what he could reconstruct of the blade's resonance interaction with the Queen's attunement field. The caller Varith had visited 4 times. The conversations had been terse. The situation, as he understood it, was as follows. The attuned blade was the physical medium through which the Queen synchronized her neural harmonic with the station's resonance infrastructure. Without it, her signal could not propagate through the walls at sufficient amplitude to maintain the colony's distributed consciousness. Without that synchronization, the Varith's collective cognition, 40,000 individual nervous systems that functioned as a single distributed mind, was degrading. Not catastrophically. Not yet. But the secondary resonance chamber, which served as a relay node for the station's eastern sector, had begun to produce a feedback loop without the Queen's harmonic to regulate it. The loop was small. It was growing. "She needs the blade," Yusef said, on the caller Varith's 4th visit. "She cannot take the blade. The blade has bonded to your signature. If she attempts to reattune it, the conflicting signatures will produce a discharge that will," the caller paused for translation, "unmake the Eastern resonance grid." "How long does she have?" "Before the feedback cascade reaches critical. The analysts estimate 31 hours, before the colony's distributed cognition suffers irreversible fragmentation. Less." Yusef looked at his notes. He'd been looking at them for 2 days. He'd been looking at the blade, which sat on the cell's ledge and pulsed with a rhythm that was, embarrassingly, recognizable as his own resting heart rate. He'd been mapping the Queen's signal, what he'd recorded of it in the chamber before the lights went out, against the blade's current output, and there was a pattern there that he kept almost seeing and then losing, the way you could almost see a face in static. He picked up the blade. The pulse quickened slightly. in sync with his own quickened pulse, and he held it up to the wall and watched how the wall's ambient signal interacted with the blade's output at various angles. "The Queen's harmonic," he said. "What frequency does it operate at?" The Collar Vareth gave him a number in a unit he had to convert. He did the conversion. He looked at the number for a long time. Then he began to hum. Not a song. A tone, a specific frequency that he'd calculated from the Queen's recorded pattern, approximated to human vocal range, adjusted upward by the harmonic ratio that appeared over and over again in the Vareth resonance architecture. A xenoarchaeologist's reconstruction of a sound he had never heard from a biology that did not make sounds. The blade went white. Not the dangerous white of the chamber when the conflicting signatures had fought. This was a different white, slower, more like the light that came through ice. The blade was not broadcasting his signature anymore. It was broadcasting both, his pattern and the Queen's pattern, layered, running together in a structure that Yusef recognized from his mapping of the ruins below. Not one frequency overtaking the other. Two frequencies interlocked. A bridge. He was still humming when the cell wall dissolved. Not broke, dissolved. The resin reabsorbing itself with the quiet efficiency of a living system rerouting. And the Collar Vareth was standing there with an expression that Yusef could now, after 2 days of study, read with some confidence as, "I have no category for this." "Take me to the Queen," Yusef said. They moved fast. The station was degrading audibly, or rather visibly. The walls were flickering in ways that had stopped being the background carrier signal and started being the biological equivalent of a system throwing errors. Vareth in the corridors moved with the jerky, interrupted coordination of a colony whose shared timing was slipping. Two of them collided at an intersection and stood touching shells for a long moment, resyncing through direct contact, a behavior the Gethmoran survey had described as emergency tactile reentrainment, something used when the ambient signal was insufficient. The Queen's chamber had 17 Vareth in it now, and they were all touching the walls. The Queen herself was, diminished was the wrong word, contracted. The 43 connection points between her cradle and the walls had gone dark, and her own pattern had reduced to something small and effortful, a signal broadcasting into an infrastructure that could no longer hear it without the blade to carry it. She was still thinking. Her shells still moved with the tide of her cognition, but it was like watching someone shout into a void. Yusef walked to the center of the chamber. He was still humming. He adjusted the pitch. The Queen's pattern he'd been nodding for the past 40 minutes of walking had a drift component, a slow oscillation that moved the frequency up and down over a 20-second cycle. He tracked it. His voice tracked it with him, which required a kind of attention that left no room for anything else. Not for the Vareth watching him, not for the Collar Vareth translating nothing because there was nothing to translate, not for the fact that he was a human archaeologist standing in the center of an alien queen's resonance chamber, holding a sword that had bonded to his heartbeat, and attempting to reconstruct her signal from 2 days of field notes. The blade responded to the drift. He understood this only in retrospect, because at the time he was too busy tracking the frequency, learning from him the same way it had learned his heartbeat. It was a very sophisticated piece of technology, Object 7 Gamma. It had been built to a tune. It was a tuning. He walked toward the Queen. The Collar Vareth made a sound that the collar did not translate. Several of the wall-touching Vareth turned. The Queen's shell pulsed, a single strong oscillation, the first strong signal she'd produced since the chamber had gone dark, and Yusef stopped, 2 meters from her cradle, and held the blade up between them, still humming, and waited. The Queen's next pulse found the blade. The blade found Yusef's voice. Yusef's voice found the blade's broadcast, which found the walls and the walls. The walls answered. Not all at once. It ran like a tide coming in. First the filaments nearest the cradle, then the next layer, then the next. the carrier signal returning in a wave that moved outward from the center of the chamber and continued moving, out through the corridors, out through the station's infrastructure, finding the relay nodes in the secondary chambers and the feedback loop in the eastern sector, and smoothing it, regulating it, the Queen's harmonic restored to the infrastructure that had been built for it. It took 4 seconds. Yusef lowered the blade. He stopped humming. His voice had been doing something at the end that he hadn't entirely been controlling: harmonics, overtones, the body finding resonances that the conscious mind hadn't calculated, and the silence that followed was very loud. 40,000 Vareth came back into alignment simultaneously. He could not feel this. He was not part of the colony, but he could see what happened to the 23 Vareth in the chamber. They exhaled, if that was the right word for the simultaneous release of held luminescence, and their shells went to a color that was not in the Gethmoran survey's catalog, a color that Yusef spent 30 seconds describing into his recorder with inadequate vocabulary before he found, finally, the right word. Relief. The blade was pulsing with 2 patterns now. They did not conflict. They ran together in the structure he'd first mapped in the ruins below, the same architecture, the same ratio, the same interlocking rhythm that the third expansion Vareth had built into every wall of every chamber that now lay buried in a dead moon's crust. He hadn't known what it meant when he'd found it in the ruins. He'd cataloged it as architectural ornamentation. It was a chord. The Queen's shell flickered, a sequence he did not have in his notes, a pattern produced for no structural reason that he could identify, directed at no one in particular, or possibly directed at him. The Collar Vareth was silent for a long moment. "She is asking," the Collar Vareth said finally, "how you knew to do that." Yusef looked at the blade. The blade looked back at him, pulsing with his heartbeat and the Queen's harmonic in the same slow, interlocked rhythm, 2 biologies that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with each other, bound by a technology built for one and adopted by both. "I didn't know," he said. "I noticed." The Collar Vareth translated. The Queen's shell ran through a sequence too fast and too complex to follow. "She says," the Collar Vareth said, after a pause that lasted long enough to suggest that translation was not the source of the delay, that in 40,000 years of contact with other species, no one has ever navigated a Vareth resonance system by ear. "I had 2 days of field notes," Yusef said, "and the ruins were very informative." He handed the blade to the Collar Vareth, who held it with the particular carefulness of someone holding something that has stopped being what they thought it was. The blade's pulse did not change when it left Yusef's hands. It continued to carry both signatures, his and the Queen's, running together in that interlocked rhythm. It would carry them for as long as its material composition maintained conductivity, years, possibly decades. Somewhere in the Queenhold, 40,000 nervous systems that thought collectively felt the edge of a different kind of mind brush against the architecture of their shared cognition. Not part of it, not intruding on it, simply present. A human's bioelectrical signature, encoded in the blade that now sat in the Queen's cradle, woven permanently into the harmonic that moved through every wall. The Vareth who experienced this, all 40,000 of them, simultaneously, did not have words for what it was. Their taxonomy of minds had not previously required a category for something that does not think the way we think, but listened carefully enough to sing in our key. They would need to build one. Yusef was already writing his notes on the walk back to the excavation site. The door to the sub-chamber had been resealed properly, this time, with a new lock whose mechanism was not corroded. But the Collar Vareth had given him a key, which was more than he'd expected, and a research access agreement that was significantly more comprehensive than anything the *Karst survey team had ever been offered. The Dead Moon's ruins were the third expansion Vareth's last architecture. They had built resonance chambers and court structures into every wall of every tunnel for reasons that the modern Vareth had largely lost. The agreement allowed Yusef, his team, eventually, though he would not tell them about the sword until he'd written it up properly, access to the full catalogued archive of the Queenhold's historical records. He descended into the tunnels. The air down here was cold and mineral and silent in a way that above it was not. His headlamp caught the wall filaments, inert, unlit, 300 years past any signal they'd ever carry. He put his hand on the wall and felt, very faintly, the same ratio he'd found everywhere up there. Built in, baked in, the proportion that kept appearing in the Vareth's resonance architecture across 600 years of sites and 15 different construction periods, and one extinction-level cultural discontinuity that nobody fully understood. Two patterns interlocked, not one overwhelming the other, a chord. He thought, I'm going to be here a while. The tunnels went down a long way, and he had not yet reached the bottom.